Hello and welcome to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's Ask an Atheist. I'm FFRF staff attorney Chris Line, and this week we're talking about the rapid expansion of state voucher programs across the U.S. and how many of them are using your tax dollars to fund private religious schools. Joining me in studio today is Hirsch Joshi, a legal fellow here at FFRF.
Hi.
As always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today. Please leave your questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show.
So joining us today is Jess Piper, Executive Director of Blue Missouri, an advocate for public schools. Good afternoon, Jess. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, it's so good to be with you guys. I think I'm supposed to be scared of you, right? I mean, you clearly say that you are atheist. I don't see any horns. My name is Jess Piper. I am from Missouri. I was a teacher for 16 years. I decided to run for the Missouri House and House District 1. I got my tail kicked, but in the process, I really showed people that there are progressive people that live in very rural spaces. I'm in a town of 480 people on the Missouri-Iowa border, you know, in cornfields and bean fields, and saying, hey, we're progressive here. But my platform was really based on education and the defunding of schools in Missouri. And I'm so glad to be with you guys today.
Yeah, thanks for being on here. I know we've followed you on social media for a long time, and you are a great activist, and we've seen a lot. And I also met you out at the Summit for Religious Freedom. There's a website for people to learn more about. I met you out at the Summit for Religious Freedom in D.C., and I had been encouraging FFRF for a while to have you come on, so I'm glad that you're here with us today.
Thank you, friend.
So our discussion today stems from a report by the Washington Post from last week concerning billions of taxpayer dollars going to religious schools through state voucher programs. In addition to reporting on the dramatic expansion of voucher programs across the country and eroding the line between state and church, the article documents the astronomical sums going to religious schools.
And for those unfamiliar, school vouchers are meant to help fund tuition at private schools for low-income families. But according to the Washington Post, which examined one of the country's largest voucher programs, the vast majority of that money is being used for religious schools. That, of course, opens up the question, isn't this a violation of church-state separation?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think most people are going to wonder about this. Like, how are we taking all this taxpayer dollars and how are we using that to fund religious schools? Well, it was against the Constitution until in 2002 when, in a case called Zellman, the Supreme Court actually ruled that an Ohio voucher program was fine because it wasn't the state, the taxpayer money wasn't going directly to religion. We were giving that to parents who then they were giving the taxpayer dollars to religion. That was a narrow 5-4 decision that hinged on Kennedy, who kind of flip-flops on these issues, and that was back when we had sort of a more moderate Supreme Court. Since that time, things have gotten much worse in this area in terms of funding and taxpayer dollars going to religion, with the court's decisions in Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue and Carson v. Macon. Those cases really flipped the law completely on its head. Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent in Carson, actually said, "This ruling leads us to a place where the separation of church and state becomes a constitutional violation." Espinoza had held that the Free Exercise Clause prohibited a state from excluding religious schools from private aid programs solely because of their religious character. And then Carson went even further. That required the state of Maine to fund religious education at private religious schools as part of its tuition assistance program. Now, that's something that had always been illegal up to this point, and in fact is an important part of the founding of our country. Both James Madison and Jefferson were really big on the idea that our taxpayer dollars should not fund religion, and specifically religious education. And now this new extreme Supreme Court that we've got has completely flipped that over and actually came out in that Carson case and said, no, to deny taxpayer funds to religious organizations, that's actually a violation of the Constitution, completely erasing the Establishment Clause and prioritizing religious freedom over our secular government. And so we can talk a little bit more about how big of a chunk of religious schools, how big a chunk of that money religious schools are receiving. The Post found that in Ohio, more than 90% of this year's school voucher recipients attended religious schools. In Wisconsin, that was 96%, and in Indiana, that was 98%. And nationally, about 77% of students attending private schools go to religious schools. Jess, you were a teacher yourself and have since become very active in this area. What are the issues with vouchers and things that you're seeing specifically in Missouri?
The biggest issue is they are defunding our public schools. And when you're talking about someone like me and my daughter, she goes to a school where there's 18 other kids in her class. There's no choice. They put it under the term school choice. There is no choice. The closest private school that I could get my daughter to is 56 miles one way. Oh, and by the way, it's Catholic. I'm not Catholic. So this is problematic. They are defunding our schools by doing something. In Missouri, it's not an expanded voucher system yet. It's called ESAs, Educational Scholarships. And what these do is they give a dollar for dollar tax credit for someone who purchases them, and then they can just give them to a random kid off the street, right? Hey, I got my $10,000 tax credit. Here's your tuition for the year. But we know, just like you were saying, this is not meant for poor kids. This is not meant for rural kids. Even if I could get my daughter 56 miles one way, I mean, I need gas. I'd have to take off work, right? She needs a uniform. You've got to pay for every single course that you want. You've got to pay for uniforms. You got to pay to play everything there. So they're set up differently. And oh, by the way, they don't participate in free and reduced lunches, which is what kids from marginalized and oppressed communities would need. So we need to get that off the table right off the bat. It is absolutely not meant for poor kids, marginalized or oppressed kids. And also, like you were saying, in Missouri, 2/3 of the kids who receive an ESA scholarship were already in a private school. In Arkansas, it's 95%. And in Iowa, what we saw is this. They passed vouchers last year, and then the private religious schools turned around and raised their tuition. So now you're like, hey, I've got $7,000, I've got $8,000, give me an education. And they're like, by the way, it's 13 now. Mm-hmm. So it's just a sleight of hand with everything. It's not accessible. They don't have to take kids with disabilities. They don't have to take kids with 504s. You know what happens if your kid happens to get a voucher and goes to a religious school, a private school? They then use the special education services of the defunded public school. And so the whole thing it's a scam right in front of our eyes. And I'm kind of sick of it.
Yeah, just to touch on a couple of things. I mean, yeah, the positive spin they've tried to say is that it was for poor and rural kids. But we know that actually voucher schools originally happened after Brown v. Board of Education. It was a way for people who were against segregation to take their white kids out of the public school system so that they didn't have to segregate. That was the origins of voucher school programs. So not even really to help poor and rural, because that wasn't the real start of it. So it's been bad for different reasons, since the very beginning. And then I'll also add on that you mentioned the Iowa schools where they raised tuition once the funding was upped. You didn't know that they specifically raised the amount to the exact amount the funding had, like it was a 1-to-1 match on. What an interesting coincidence that the cost rose exactly to that of the available money. Which just highlighting what you're saying, that this is not about providing opportunities for students. The supporters say school voucher programs give parents more choices, but as you noted, and some, including a majority of justices on the Supreme Court apparently, might argue that excluding religious schools from voucher programs is religious discrimination. And Hirsch, why is that wrong?
So as you mentioned, Chris, we did look at the Virginia statute on religious liberty and freedom, and there it turns out Madison and Jefferson did reject this idea that funding private schools was part of the religious freedom aspect. They actually cited the Establishment Clause, or the Disestablishment Clause, as they would have called it, for a reason to not fund these private schools, including when it came to religious sort of expenditures, like on teachers, like on Bibles, things like that. So we really kind of get away from the original intent that the Supreme Court apparently loves so much in how we're interpreting some of these statutes and whether they're constitutional or not. Jess, I did want to ask you one question specifically about Missouri. So one thing that we're seeing, Chris did mention desegregation, but now of course we're seeing with Christians everywhere apparently that they just don't want to accept gay and trans kids. Are some of these private schools that are getting ESAs, do they have inclusive policies for gay and trans kids, or are they discriminating? I kind of figured the answer, but I'll let you elaborate.
Yeah, they are discriminatory. You can go to these church websites and look up their schools, and they absolutely can discriminate against gay kids, LGBTQ kids, even if their parent is gay, right? I mean, they can keep a kid out for that. In fact, I mean, when we get down to it, they can keep a kid out for anything. A learning disability, they don't like the color you are. They don't like the situation, the home life you have. Your parents listen to rock and roll. I mean, there is some crazy crap floating around out there. And I'll say this, it's really weird in states like Missouri. We are 50th in teacher pay. The starting teacher pay for a Missouri teacher is $25,000 a year. And we are 49th in educational funding. And we've had the same GOP, and I know you guys are nonpartisan. I'm partisan, but I'm just going to spend 1 second here. Yeah. The GOP has been in charge for 20 years. And so we have had this system of defunding schools all this time. But this is something that's so strange. This year, they were able to come up with almost $1 billion, $1 billion to fund these private religious schools. And I'm like, guys, I retired at 16 years, a master's degree, making $41,000 a year. And now all of a sudden you've got enough money to fund not one, but two school systems. The whole thing, scam.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the toughest things I think about all this is, like I'm not the only one, far from the only one, but, I grew up in public schools. My parent, my mom worked at a sort of a large factory bakery. My dad was a janitor. But we luckily had a really good public school system. And so I was able to learn, even though we wouldn't have been able to afford a private school or anything, but we had like a good public school where I was able to learn, eventually go to public college, public law school, and I really feel like the public schools and the teachers that I learned from growing up, like really, allowed me to reach a place in my life I would not have been able to without that. And so it's such a disservice to all the students in all these different states that we're defunding the public school system. They're not often able to take advantage of these private schools where all the money is being funneled to. And so really the students are really losing out in all these states, and really all of us are worse off for it, having younger generations not have the education that they deserve, and that, more importantly, we've promised to them. The states are supposed to provide an education, and I think implied in that is that it should be a good one. It's just, the whole thing is just awful. But as you kind of noted, school vouchers are popular among conservative parents, as keeping their kids away from public education gives them more control over what they learn, or more importantly, what they don't learn. This map from EdChoice, a voucher advocacy program, shows the states that have school voucher programs. 8 of these states created or expanded their voucher programs just last year, and this year, Alabama, Georgia, and as you know, Missouri have approved or expanded voucher programs. So now taxpayers in more than half the country are now funding things like creationism, homophobia, and religious indoctrination.
Right, and it's no coincidence that these are the same states where we see political leaders and parents promoting book banning while pushing back against LGBTQ plus acceptance, sex education, Black history education, and other topics that might not align with their religious views.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the big thing that maybe gets glossed over a little bit. I think people recognize the issue with religion and, they're going to these religious schools where they're going to be potentially indoctrinated or at least taught more religion than you'd see in the public school. But even more importantly, it's the other topics, things that you wouldn't expect would necessarily be different between a private and public school, but these religious schools aren't teaching the same history. Unfortunately, they're not teaching the same topics. They're not teaching important topics everyone should hear about. They're catering to what the people paying to come to those private schools might want, and typically that's a more conservative view, which once again is just doing a huge disservice to everyone. Now the public school students aren't getting a good education. They've got no money. That's all being funneled out. The education being given in the private schools, might be good for the topics they do choose to cover. They got so much money, but they're not, covering all the topics that people need in a society, and to create well-rounded citizens who, you know, are able to interact, and even more so, you know, with this very it's a very divisive thing, creating different classes of people that we've always had, but making it worse, not better.
Right.
Whereas the public school allows us to have everyone come together. You know, if you don't have these private schools, you can have more well-off people and poor people, minorities with majorities. Everyone, you know, kind of interacts and creates sort of a miniature version of society where students are acclimated to how to live in a diverse, multicultural society.
Right, and what you'll end up getting is essentially de facto segregation, right? You'll get kids who are queer in one set of schools, and then those who are, I guess, Christian and not in another set of schools. You're going to get children with disabilities in public schools, and those without in the Christian public schools. So even if there isn't a law that says, you know, keep these certain people here and these certain people here, you will end up with a segregated society anyways.
Yeah, and specifically with the religious angle, this is one thing I've often brought up, that it seems unfair they're basically taking both sides of the fight. So they're saying, we're going to keep pushing religion into public schools through, you know, they're trying to put the Ten Commandments out, they're trying to put chaplains in schools. So they're trying to tear down the separation of church and state and have our public schools have more religion, more religious indoctrination, while at the same time taking all the money out of the public schools to fund private religious schools and encourage people to go to these private religious schools. So they're kind of having it both ways,
right.
Not accepting our neutral public schools or anything like that. But Jess, so what would you suggest our viewers do to fight back against voucher programs?
Well, the first thing I would say is speak up, but I want to say something about what you had mentioned earlier about the vouchers being, you know, popular in certain states, and it's not true. In states like Missouri, in fact, this is nationwide. They have never put school vouchers on the ballot, and it has passed. Never. Because it's not popular. And I knock doors in the middle of nowhere. You know, I knock doors in towns of people of, you know, there's 120 people in town. Not one person came to the door and said, I would like you to defund North Nottoway so I can send my money to LeBond Catholic School 56 miles away. Nobody. Everybody loves their schools. When I knock doors, people are worried about other people's schools, but they're not worried about theirs. So what happens in these states is they get with these conservative lawmakers and they pass voucher bills behind closed doors. The people who are getting their pockets lined with, you know, public tax money are creating the bills, giving it to them and passing it behind the closed doors because they know if they put it on the ballot, it will not win. It will not win in any state in this country. And so that's where you see trouble like in Texas and in Tennessee. And that is with rural Republicans who absolutely cannot stand to defund their schools because there's no other choice. And they'll get run out, right, by their constituents if they defund the schools. But then you have their leadership saying, if you don't, then we'll run you out. And so it's gotten to a point, and this is why I think as a rural person, I try to activate other rural people because the heart of democracy in schools and everything else runs straight through these red states who, if they stand up, if they say, we're not going to let you take, you know, school funding away from our kids, it will stop. And so what I would say to people is reach out and talk to your representative and tell them, you know, if you vote to defund my schools, I'm going to take out a billboard. It costs $250 a month and I'm going to pay for it. And I'm going to tell everybody in the community that you took money away from our kids because it's not popular. And so we just have to keep preaching this message. There aren't a lot of people that want to defund schools. They're just such a small minority. So we always have to remember that. These are loud people. The book banners are loud people. I mean, we have it going on in the community south of me. And these people don't even have kids in the school district. You know, it's outrageous. And they asked them on the form, hey, you want to ban the bluest eye? Did you read it? And they freely admitted to not reading it. So when we give this message to our friends and our family and our community, everyone starts to realize, right? It's a scam. And I got a good public education and you did too. And so did your neighbors. And that's what we want to continue.
Oh, that's great. So we will be turning to questions here in a second. So we'll just remind you again, if you've got any questions, you can ask that in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, or you can email us at askanatheist@ffrf.org. Yeah, and just to sum up there what you said, I mean, that was great. And if we wish to live in an equitable society, we got to refocus our efforts on strengthening the public schools that are the bedrock of our communities. We have to advocate for public schools that are robustly funded, accountable to communities, and accessible to every child. And then with that, I will go ahead and turn to some questions, see what we got here. Okay, start with this one. Is it true that part of the impetus towards private/religious schools was racist, to separate white Christians from non-whites?
Yes. The answer is yes. So you really saw school vouchers take off after Brown versus Board, and the language there being all deliberate speed. To desegregate schools. Well, the people who didn't want to desegregate, as Chris mentioned, wanted to go to private schools, and that's really where we started to see this drastic incline in people going to private schools. But you needed to make that affordable for those people, so that included school vouchers. So the answer to the question is a very unambiguous yes.
And by the way, those schools were called segregation academies. And I think if we go back to calling them segregation academies, maybe people would realize what was going on.
Yeah. So we got another question. Wasn't one of the original justifications for voucher programs that private schools were providing a superior education or getting better educational outcomes? Is that really happening? Jess, you want to take that one?
I would love to take that one. In general, when we think about private schools, we think of, lush lawns and leather-bound books and kids in uniforms and these well-trained teachers. And what actually happens is there's a Pizza Hut that goes out of business, and the local church, buys the Pizza Hut and puts kids into cubicles and has someone who is not a certified teacher, doesn't even have a college degree, and has them, working with these kids, coaching them, doing worksheets and, work online. I was a teacher for 16 years. I'd have got fired in 2 seconds if I'd have done that. I was well trained. I have a master's degree. I'm certified. And so all of these things that make public school teachers good, they don't have to do on the other side, right? You're not getting Robin Williams, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." You're getting the Sunday school teacher that's, 20 years old with a felt board, right?
And just to add on to that, in certain topics in which you really do want a vast education on. So for instance, a comprehensive sex ed, these teachers essentially that Jess is describing are essentially arguing that the First Amendment allows them to teach whatever they want, and that includes abstinence and not something that's just comprehensive. And we see in those communities time and time again that when you only teach like an abstinence-based education, a sex ed, then you really don't get the outcomes that you were thinking of. You actually get higher teen pregnancy, higher STI rates, all the things that sex ed is meant to prevent ends up happening.
Yeah, I'm going to combine two questions because they're similar but different. So one asks, what are some good resources I can use to find out if my state is considering implementing a voucher program, and how can I bring more attention to it if one is coming? But also, another person asks, if my state already has a voucher program, is there anything I can do to fight back against it? So you've got both either new ones coming up, and how can you find out about those and do something about it, and what might you be able to do about ones that already exist? I don't know if either one of you want to take that.
I guess speaking about ones that may already exist, so those are already going on. So you have really two options. There's a legislative option of trying to get that repealed, and then there's the also daunting litigation option, and that might require a little bit more research within your state and on your state's laws.
Yeah, because as I've seen, I was doing some research for this, I saw there are a few lawsuits going on right now about this,
Right.
typically surrounding the provisions in state constitutions that require a public education, which kind of makes sense. I mean, given if you follow the natural endpoint of all this money going to private schools, eventually the public schools won't exist, and then states will not be abiding by their constitution that requires a public education anymore.
Right.
So it's sort of a down the road problem. But Jess, you've got a little bit more on the ground experience, so maybe you can answer this. If many of the states with voucher programs have them passed behind closed doors, are there ways to open these doors or get inside meetings to shut them down or to work on that?
Be loud. I mean, I'm not invited to any meetings for some weird reason. They won't invite me. But I think that people need to stay involved with their state rep and their state senator. That's where things are coming through. That's where they're coming down. If you are in a conservative state, you can bet your bottom dollar they are trying to pass school vouchers in your state. And like I said, everybody needs to understand that these are not for, not for anybody except for like a coupon for rich kids that are already going. It is class warfare. It is absolutely taking, money from us, from regular taxpayers in these tiny little spaces and sending it off to, wherever, Columbia, to Springfield, to Kansas City, to educate kids in spaces that my kid doesn't have any access to. And I'm telling you, that is a very good message when you're knocking a door. They're taking your money and sending it to town, and your kid has nothing to show for it. In fact, 30% of Missouri schools are on a 4-day week. We have defunded schools so much that there are kids, tons of kids in my area, that only get a 4-day week education. And my lawmakers will turn around and say, well, we're not showing that anything bad is happening. And I said, show me a good school. Show me a blue ribbon school that is 4 days a week. And you can't do it because they don't exist. It is class warfare, 100%. Our kids don't have access to these schools. And at the end of the day, it's just not fair. It's not fair.
That's a good answer. So this next question is about fighting fire with fire, which we'll see what you guys think about it. Do secular advocates against vouchers have a counterpart to state-sponsored religious indoctrination, or is the best plan to ensure they don't pass legislation to begin with?
I see a lot of people doing the Church of Satan. Like if you have chaplains come in, we're going to have the Church of Satan come in. And I will say that in most areas, that messaging is not good. People don't want to hear that. And so I would say fight fire with education and with groups of people. Get your crew together, get all the moms from PTA, talk to people in your community and show them what's happening. And then just, pepper your lawmakers with, if you do this, we're going to let everyone know and you're going to lose your job.
Yeah, I mean, in prepping for the show, I actually was looking on Reddit, and there was a discussion about voucher schools, and that's what someone brought up. They said, hey, if you're so concerned about these religious schools, creating the schools and getting the money, why don't you just create your own, sort of secular school that can compete, a secular private school to compete with them or whatever. Just, because we have secular public schools that already exist, we shouldn't do it. And we're never going to have the funding, the Catholic Church is the biggest private school group, I think, in the country, and they've got such a head start and ways to get money that we would never, it's a terrible idea to try to keep things going private and just create better private options necessarily. The real solution is to fund our public schools that we already have, that are, in state constitutions, and that provide an education for everyone. That is the secular schools that we would create to compete. So
right, I do think that with the satanic temple or chaplains or whatever, you do get some shock value that can be effective in some places. I am reminded of an Idaho committee that heard that there might be a satanic chaplain coming into a school if they sign off on a bill allowing chaplains. Well, it turns out they didn't sign off after hearing that. So you might get some of the shock value that can help. I think once you have a bill passed, it might only serve to hurt, but it might be a good tool when you're hearing of these new bills to say, yes, I'm a teacher, I'm part of some organization that Christians hate, which are a lot, and I plan on funding a school for it. And if you think that's promotion, wait until I tell you about your school.
And then your contract will not be renewed.
Right.
And you will never be a teacher in the state again.
Yeah, I mean, it's great as a tool to try to get legislators to think about what they're doing. We think this is just to advance Christianity, but the way we're writing it, even religions we don't like could do the same things, but in practice, it's just never going to compete on the same level. It's the
Right.
same. It also stops people from fighting in the way that they should. I mean, we see that around other areas where the Satanic Temple can come in to join a forum. People forget, oh yeah, we can say that there shouldn't be an invocation to start a public meeting. We don't have to jump to, oh, okay, go ahead, and we're going to accept that you should have this thing, and then we're going to have the Satanists come participate. Sometimes it'll stop people from fighting back about the fact that we shouldn't have it at all because they're so excited to have the Satanists come in and create a whole big stir. So.
Right.
Okay, we got another question here. What office has the authority to grant vouchers? What criteria are they using to determine eligibility? And if they don't use the money, where does it go?
Go ahead, Jess, please.
Well, I was going to say, in Missouri, it goes through the treasurer's office. And what they initially did was have an income cap, right? Because why would someone who's making $250,000 a year in Missouri need a school voucher? And this last bit that they passed where they're trying to expand the program, they took away the cap, the income cap. And you were seeing that in state after state after state. So this is something that I find really horrifying. And that is in the state of Missouri, a family of 4 making $39,000 does not qualify for a free reduced lunch. In Missouri, a family of 4 making $165,000 qualifies for a $6,000 voucher. And if that doesn't tell you everything about the program, I don't know what will. They absolutely do not care about those poor kids. They're not even going to feed them lunch. I mean, someone making $39,000 with 2 kids or 3 kids, right? And they can't get a free lunch, but they can get a voucher for $6,000 to a school that's going to raise the price of the tuition as soon as they get there. It's a scam.
Honestly, in my brief stay in Missouri, that is the most Missouri thing I've ever heard. So that it doesn't shock me that much, but that makes sense. That makes good sense. I will comment that the state of Maine, which does have a sort of voucher program, as we know from the Carson case, does enact something kind of like Title IX or Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, in which, if you do get vouchers, you can't discriminate. So there are some offices out there and some departments of education that are trying to tell these voucher schools, you can't do everything you want to do, but we'll of course see how that goes.
Yeah, my answer to that was going to be that is state specific. I mean, I think the different programs are done in different ways. Some are probably similar to other states, but I think you really have to look into your specific state program to understand, where it's coming from, what they will potentially do with the funds that aren't used, things like that are probably going to be really state specific. And then we got one final question. What, if any, difficulties do groups like FFRF face when trying to stop or oppose voucher programs?
Oh gosh. I mean, what difficulties don't we face, right? One, there's just lack of organization sometimes in this idea of having a counterpart school. Like, good luck getting a bunch of people who don't like being part of an organized religion to now massively organize as part of a school voucher program. I also think that there's some difficulty, and I think Jess was alluding to this earlier, with teachers who have student debt. Right, and they want to teach secular schools. They might agree with us on everything, but now they have to pay back that student debt. Here you have private schools that are willing to give them some money, unless they're gay or trans, of course, and then they have to go to those schools and teach subjects that they might not want to. So I think there's some difficulties, one, in getting teachers who are able to be on our side financially, along with just getting us organized.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the other big issue here is the one that comes up in every area and every arena, which is sort of the capitalism problem. Right. In that the people most strongly advocating for voucher schools, for voucher programs, for private religious schools, are the private religious schools and groups that stand to get this money. Right. Whereas on the other hand, us fighting for public education, we get the value of our citizens being better educated and having great public schools, but we don't get any money in our pocket because we're fighting for public schools. Whereas those fighting for private schools, the biggest proponents, the people leading the groups behind them, they actually get that voucher money oftentimes. So there is a strong economic incentive on their side to fight for these issues, whereas, we're fighting because it's what's right, and what makes for the best country and programs. Yeah, so I guess we'll go ahead and that'll wrap up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Thank you, Jess, for coming on.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and we'll put up her webpage here one more time, bluemissouri.org. Yeah, it was great having you. We appreciate your time. Don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, you'll hear from Professor Anthony Pinn about his new book, The Black Practice of Disbelief, a show all about Black non-believers ahead of the Juneteenth holiday. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out our latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
If you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, you can check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us, and we'll see you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.